People prefer the YouTube because then it stays for afterwards.
Yeah.
So people can go back and see it this time. Just grab the door. Sure, thanks. You okay, Isha? You were traveling or something this morning?
Traffic. Yeah. I tried to leave as early as possible, but it was 4.5 hours to get here.
From the north. Wow. Where were you?
Yeah, Shlomi.
That's can't get much farther north than that.
It's typically a 2-hour drive, and
From Shlomi? Wow.
drive here every day. 2.5 hours.
Shlomi's far north.
Very far north.
It's usually 2.5
border.
hours.
It's like at the border, you said?
It's on the border, yeah. You have people there, you know?
I have good friends.
The farthest north I've ever went was Katsuri.
It's close. It's close to being as far. Anyways, glad to see you there. I'm happy you had a good time, and I'm glad you got there back and safely. And, terrific. Okay, and is it Aryeh? Aryeh, right? Daniel. Sorry. Hey, Daniel. Okay. So you had a question to start us off about Shemitah.
Yeah,
I'm happy to entertain
how
now.
do you eat the food?
How do you eat the food? So, it's a good question. You have to treat it as holy food. You can't waste it. You can't sell it, and you can't, do anything untowards with it. But you eat it. You eat it. Yeah, you eat it. Whatever grows from the 6th year, and whatever, like the fruits that come once a year. So the fruits that come in the 7th year, you're supposed to eat it, but you don't harvest it like you're the owner. It's hefker. It's ownerless. And everybody gets whatever they need, and that's the short answer. But I see you're looking at the book about Shemitah. Yeah, this book is primarily about the philosophy behind Shemitah. This is the introduction of Rav Kook to his book on Shemitah, which is a halachic work, but the introduction is a discussion of the philosophy of Shemitah. Yeah.
How come we don't have to take tithes when we transfer? Because here's why I asked, because I remember being told that with that grapefruit tree outside of my house, that if I pick it and eat it, it's fine, because the tree's hefker. But that if I give it to somebody else, that they may have to tithe.
No, not at all.
That
Not
is
true.
correct?
Incorrect. Yes.
So you don't take off Trumas Minus first Shemitah.
You don't. There's no Trumas and Meisers on Shemitah. It's hefker. It's ownerless.
But you're
Only the
not
owners.
plant.
Right. You don't plant. Right. So you have very limited vegetables.
It
But
doesn't-
fruit comes year by year without planting.
It doesn't become owned at some point, though?
No.
That's why somebody says, once I give it to somebody else, that I'm transferring it.
There's no obligation to take off tithes on the 7th year products. Product from the 7th year. Okay. What we're going to do now is we're moving on. We discussed Truma and Meiser at length. We even did a practice session. Some of you were here and enjoyed the sunflower seeds. I showed you how it works. All important detail that we didn't really say at the beginning is that before you say this, blessing, and before you say the recitation of exactly what designating each type of tithe, you separate off a little more than 1%, and then of course the equivalent. Everything goes to its right place, and then that little bit that you separated off. After you said all the blessings and you said the recitation, you wrap that up and you throw it in the garbage. So we did mention that, but that's the beginning, is separating off a little more than 1%, and then nothing off the tithe. So now we're moving on to the next topic. Next topic is Khala, the mitzvah of Khala. Yeah.
One of the questions that came up over Shabbos regarding things in the Shemitah year.
Yes.
So you serve salad. People take salad. Some people don't finish their salad.
What do you do with the leftovers?
Normally I would just throw that
Good
out.
question. So as I said briefly to Daniel, as I said briefly, that you have to take care that you don't ruin the leftovers. The leftovers are holy. And so generally what's done is that you put them in a separate bag. You don't put them in the garbage directly because the garbage is disgusting. So you can't throw them into the disgusting garbage. So you put them in a separate bag, and then you just keep them there, separate from the garbage, until they're gonna just deteriorate on their own. So nobody's gonna eat them, and then you throw them out. And then if it's no longer edible, good food, so then you can throw them out. So you take that bag and you put it in the garbage. So sometimes people have a separate bin for that temporary storage. Call it a kedushat shvi bin, if you will. But also you could just put it in a bag and wrap it up and then put it in the regular garbage. It's an extra chumrah to keep it separate until it starts to, the next day really, until it goes bad. If you keep something out of the fridge,
So you don't have to wait till it's rotten or not.
it doesn't have to be really rotten, just a little bit rotten. That's right. And essentially, you don't have to wait at all, as long as it's separate. You don't dump it into the disgusting garbage. That's treating it with
So one
holiness.
can take like a shopping bag, put it in that, tie it off,
Yeah.
and then so that way,
Absolutely, yeah.
okay.
That's what you should be doing. That's what I've been doing since the beginning of this year, the calendar year, the Jewish calendar year, because the fruits and the vegetables right away, if it's picked after Rosh Hashanah, you have to treat it with holiness. The fruit, not yet. None of the fruit yet. Now maybe a little bit of fruit is starting, but none of the fruit that's being marketed now was grown during the Shemitah year, and so it doesn't have the status of Shemitah year. Only in the latter part of the year, after Hanukkah, then we'll start to get some fruit which come from the Shemitah year. They're grown in the Shemitah year, and you have to treat them with holiness too. Okay, but back to the laws of our new topic, the mitzvah of Khala. Everybody knows Khala. What's Khala?
That's a good question. I have a question about it.
Yeah, what's Khala?
What's Khala?
What is Khala? So Khala is a word in Hebrew which is usually, in 9 times out of 10, if you talk to people about Khala, that you're referring to a special bread which is used for Shabbat and for Yom Tov. Sometimes it's braided. Custom is to make them braided, and baking challah can be lots of fun. And you can get a recipe from your grandmother, you can get a recipe from the internet, and you can join with other friends to bake challah. And that's the meaning of the word challah. It's just a special type of bread. However, when we say there's a mitzvah of challah, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about
taking out the tithes.
No, without taking off another separation. You have to separate from a dough, which you make when you're baking bread. And when you're baking regular bread or baking challah, it doesn't matter. Any bread that you bake, when you have a dough of a certain size, you have to have a certain quantity. But whenever you have, we'll talk about that in detail, but whatever you have this dough that you're making bread from, you have to separate something. That something, confusingly enough, is called. So you have to separate off challah when you're baking challah. And you have to separate off challah when you're baking bread. And you have to separate challah when you're baking cake and cookies too. Whenever you have a dough, we're going to see exactly the definition of a dough, of a certain quantity, you have to separate off. The mitzvah is to take challah. Challah obviously is being used with a different meaning than the standard meaning, which I told you at the beginning. The colloquial term challah is used for that special Jewish bread. But the mitzvah of challah is to separate off a portion of a dough, and whatever you're making with that dough, whether it's cake, cookies, or whatever it is, or challah, you separate off a little bit, and that mitzvah is the mitzvah to separate challah.
It's a specified portion or any.
You specify a portion, and we're going to talk about the details right now. Yeah.
That's why we do a bracha of lechem on Khala, because it's considered.
No. The mitzvah.
Hamotzi.
Every food we make a blessing before we eat the food, and everything that grows from the ground we say
Yeah.
Borei Pri Adam.
Mhm.
Everything, but there's something very special about bread, even though really what's it made from? It's made from wheat, which grows from the ground. So you should say Borei Pri Adam on it, but we don't, because you can't see the grains anymore. It's turned into flour. So what should you say on it? Shehakol. You should say shehakol because you can't see the individual seeds that it comes from anymore. And the halacha is if you have something made from corn, potato chips.
Mhm.
Most potato chips, the bracha is shehakol, because they've taken the potatoes and they've ground them up and reconstitute them, like Pringles, into the shape of a chip. But really, it's shehakol. There are some potato chips which are just thin slices of potato that are fried up And those you should make ha'adama because you actually see the original fruit or vegetable as it is, and then you say ha'adama. But if you take the wheat and you turn it into flour, you should say shahako. We have a special treatment of bread because bread is known as the, what's it called? The
Staff of life.
staff of life. Bread is very significant food for all human civilization from time immemorial. And in Halachot too, in the Jewish tradition too, this was the major food. And even more importantly, there were breads baked for the temple service. And so anything that's brought to the temple obviously gets a very special stature. And so we have a special bracha for bread, and that's hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Okay? And that's why we make the bracha on hamotzi lechem min haaretz. It's nothing to do with what we have to do to make it kosher. Now we come to what Ezra sort of slipped and said, well, what we've been talking about up till now is that before you have your vegetable, your tomato, and your cucumber, you have to separate off some tithes. It's similar that here you have, even though you've already tithed the wheat berries and the flour, you have to tithe those. You have to take off the truma and the meiser. When you turn it into a dough, there's an additional mitzvah that you have to separate some of the dough.
You said wheat and flour. Do you mean separately or you mean inclusive?
Either one, whichever one. Usually you
Okay.
do it when the processing is done. That's what, if you remember back to the laws of truma and meiser, we said it's only obligated to take off the truma and meiser once the processing is done. So if you're making flour, if you're harvesting the wheat in order to make flour, usually it's done after it's flour.
Okay.
What is the two words you said, the trun and the meister, what is that?
So this we studied the last 2 weeks. You weren't here.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Jacob, but basically it's the two words which the Torah uses for part of the food that you have to separate off
Okay.
and give to the Kohen or to the Levi, or eat it yourself in Jerusalem. There's a whole system of tithing, which means separating off. The two major names there are two types of truma and there's two types of meiser, three types of meiser. We studied that. That's in the previous chapter. I can show you the books and give you a reference.
The challah is taken off after baking or before?
Actually, best before.
Uh-huh.
We're going to see the details. It's usually taken off after you form the dough, before baking
And I didn't
the
catch what
dough.
you said.
Khala?
Any dough?
We're going to get to the
Okay.
details right now, okay? But basically, let's open up. Can we give one of these to everybody? We're looking for Bamidbar, chapter 15. And if there's not enough, then you can pull it up on your phones or grab ones from the other room, whichever you prefer. Bamidbar 15,
What's the Mimbar in English is,
Numbers.
Latin.
Numbers 15. Bamidbar is Numbers. Please, someone give me the page. I know it off by heart because it's my bar mitzvah parsha. Parshat Shlach, yes.
It's around 300.
It's 280.
We're looking for verse 17.
Verse, that would be 281.
281, please. Everybody turn to 281. Ezra, you can look with Yaakov, and Amos, you're looking with Daniel. The verses say
Which verse number, sorry?
17.
17, yes.
You want to read it for us, Jacob?
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, keep going?
Yeah.
I speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye come into the land whither I bring you, and it shall be that with ye eat of the bread of the land, ye shall offer up and heave offering unto the Lord. You shall offer up a cake of the first of your dough for a heave offering, as ye do the heave offering of the threshing floor. So shall ye have it of the first of your dough, and ye shall give unto the Lord a heave offering in your generations.
Okay, that's up there. So you see, they translate the word teruma as heave offering, which is a funny translation. I would just better call it truma, or something that you lift up. The harim means to lift up. Anyways, it says here, amazing verse. It says, just like the heave offering which you give at the threshing floor. David, what was I telling you? When you finish the processing of the vegetables, of the produce, you have to take off truma. So too, you should take off from the dough. When you're making a dough, when you're making bread, you have to separate this additional gift, and it's called Khala. Khala tarimu truma. That's the Hebrew of that verse. You should lift up this portion called Khala. That's the mitzvah. It's from, it goes to the Kohen, like the other parts of Truma. So if we said there's 2 types of Truma, really there's 3 types of Truma. Right? We had Truma Gadola and Truma Meiser. So now you could say that really the Khala is a 3rd type of gift that we give to the Kohanim. And so obviously, we want to support the Kohanim. We talked about it a little bit, that the Kohanim were doing the worship in the temple, and they were the teachers, and they really needed, they had no fields whatsoever. They said they had no means of sustenance, and so we gave them lots of vegetables and fruit, but they got to have some bread too. So you got to have a sandwich. So the mitzvah is that every Jew who makes a dough should give a portion of it to the Kohanim. But the Kohanim were primarily in the temple. They had to keep their stuff pure, with the laws of purity and impurity, as we spoke about. And that's why nowadays it's a little bit hard to keep this law in its original form, because we don't have purity and impurity. We're all considered to be impure. We don't have a temple, so there's no reason for us to be pure. I mean, the Kohanim would have some benefit if they were pure, but we mentioned that we don't have the ashes of the red heifer, so we don't have purity. Those laws, that entire section of the Torah is really not yet practical. One day, who knows? It'll come back one day soon. So why, if we said that they're already taking off the truma and the meiser from the raw material, from the grains, you have to take off more from the dough? Well, bread is special. Bread is the staff of life. Bread is a major part of the Kohanim's diet, everybody's diet, and so the Kohanim too. And so Hashem made sense that he said, we're going to have to give it special prominence and treat it as a separate type of food, and give the Kohanim this special portion. Bread is also, much more complicated to produce than every other foodstuff. An animal, you do shechita, and then you roast it up, and you have a sandwich. A fruit, you take it off the tree, and you eat it. But to get bread, it goes through an entire process of, if you learn the laws of Shabbat, there's the threshing, and then there's the winnowing, and then there's the selecting, and then there's the grinding, and then there's the sifting, and then there's there's a lot that goes into making bread. And as I said, that's why we have the special bracha. And really, it's symbolic, perhaps, of that. We should appreciate that not only God's handiwork do we have to give of, recognize that Hashem is our benefactor, but even the stuff that we do, what we do in this world, we work hard and we produce. Also that, we realize that we couldn't do that without God either. It's not only the natural world which gets, we give recognition to God for the natural world, we give recognition to God for our work as well, for our human potential that we turn into actual, our human endeavors. We also have to recognize Hashem's grace in allowing us, giving us energy to be able to create that bread as a symbol for all of our human activity. So we have a special mitzvah. In some ways, who was the first bread? Who was the first dough? Think of a doughboy. Right? It's a pejorative. You call a little kid a fat kid. You call him a doughboy, right? Because he looks like him. So maybe I'm dated, but Pillsbury, right? They have a doughboy. But no, seriously, who was the first dough in the world? They say that Adam HaRishon. Right? God took some clay and some water, and he formed man out of earth. It's sort of like forming a dough, and man has received the moniker in the sages being called the first Khala. He's the Khala of the land, right? So sort of a combination of different elements, which gets elevated to a whole new level. And so there's a lot of stature to this idea of bread. Bread is symbolic for a higher level of the creation of the world. We have to recognize that God is responsible for all those different levels of the world as well. Okay, so far so good. Yeah, question.
So,
Yeah,
a Suda has to include eating bread, right?
it's a good question. In the ancient day, that in most of the history of the world, that's the way it was in most cultures. It wouldn't be called a meal without bread. Now we're a little bit spoiled. Now we're also a little bit aware of the carbs that not so good for our waistlines and all those kind of things. But in most civilizations, bread is still the mainstay. And in the days of Chazal, the days of our sages, around the turn of the century, 2,000 years ago, everything was eaten with bread. You can see it in the Arab cuisine till today. You sit down to a meal, they put out pita with hummus. You dip the bread in the hummus, you dip the bread in the other salad. Everything was done with dipping. Everything was dipped. The bread, you put the meat on the bread, everything, Western society, we have the concept of the sandwich. Everything's with bread. Nowadays, it's changing a little bit. It's a question of how Halachot changes, but bread still has its primary importance. And famously, on Shabbat, you're supposed to have bread at each meal, because you're supposed to have 3 meals with bread. And at each meal, do you have bread? Right? You have 2 breads, right? Because each bread represents that we get a double portion of man. And so, bread has a central role in our religious worship as well as just human culture. So there's a special mitzvah of Khala, taking off a little portion of the dough to give to the Kohen. Okay, that's the introduction. Yeah.
Just to clarify, you give the uncooked dough to the Kohen?
Yes.
And then what do they do with it?
Well, the Kohen can collect dough from this household and from that household and from that household, put it all together and make himself a nice lunch. Or even if he has one dough, he can make himself a small roll. Depends how many people he has in his household. This was in the day. This was in the day when the dough that it was giving to him was pure, and the Kohen receiving it was pure, and all the members of his family had to be pure. This was a whole special holy bread. Nowadays, we don't really have that ability because it's not. It doesn't have the ritual purity, so we'll see what we do with it. But in the day, that was the idea, that the Kohen would bake it on his own. Yeah.
If he was given dough, he could turn that into whole loaves, whereas if you took a slice off of your loaf, it wouldn't be so usable.
Right, that's right. It would get stale quicker, and the dough, he could keep it. He could add spices. He could do whatever he wants with it, and it was better for the Kohen to get the raw material, or somewhat raw material, the dough, as opposed to the baked bread.
Now, this only applies to bread that's made from the species, correct?
We're good. What do you mean, the species?
So if you make
Simple answer is the 5 grains. There's 5 grains that are considered to
five
be
wheat,
grains:
spelt,
wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Okay, those are the 5 grains in halacha. Significantly, my daughter is celiac, and people who have all sorts of wheat allergies and so forth, they can't have gluten. And surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, all these 5 grains have gluten in them. And so she can't really ever say Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. You only say Hamotzi, and she can't say Birkat Hamazon because she can't have the 5 grains. She has bread made out of potato flour, made out of all sorts of corn flour, but nothing with wheat or any of the 5 grains in it because they all have gluten.
Well, so what's the because it's off nefesh? Is she expected to do hamotzi on like potato bread or rice bread or something like that? Like, is there an expectation that she fulfilled the mitzvah with imitation bread?
It's a good question. She has to have a meal, which is defined as a halachic meal on Shabbat. We're talking about when you're supposed to have 3 meals on Shabbat. During the week, if you want to fast, you can. Some people very holy people think it's, it's part of their religious ritual to fast. We don't do that so much anymore because we get so sick that we can't daven or learn so what's the point? But you can fast during the week as much as you want, but on Shabbat you really should be eating 3 meals. That's part of the mitzvah of Shabbat. And how does she fulfill her mitzvah? Well, it's difficult. The best solution that we found is that there's a way to set a meal on one of the fruits of the 7 species, or the produce of the fruits of the 7 species. For example, wine. So when she drinks her kiddush on Friday night, she has 2 purposes. I just have one purpose. I want to make kiddush because I have to say kiddush over wine, and then I make my meal over the bread. But she has to drink more of her wine because she's fulfilling 2 mitzvot with the wine. If you drink a certain quantity of wine, that's also considered to be setting a meal. You can set a meal on one of these 7 species as well. She can have lots of grapes. She can have lots of dates. All those are the 7 species. You can actually use those, the ones that you say ala michya for, the 7 species. That's another way of setting a meal. So usually she just has a larger amount of wine and she gets drunk, but it's a lot of fun.
Only if that's kavanah or is that automatic? In other words, like, so you sit down at Purim, you have a bottle of wine, do you have to bench if you still can?
I'm not saying she has to bench. At the end she says ala michya or ala gefen, right? Yeah, and I didn't say you change the bracha. The brachas are going to be the same.
No, because the bracha is
But
that you shall eat and be satisfied. Usually we define that as having had.
That's for the Birkat HaMazon, but I'm not talking about Birkat HaMazon. I'm talking about the mitzvah to have a meal.
Right, but is there any quantity of wine, let's say, that
Yes.
ever constituted
Yes.
that you would have to bench after?
No. There's quantities of cakes that you would have to bench
Right,
after,
that's-
but
that's
not
what I-
wine.
that's what I'm remembering.
But she's not having
Is
cakes.
that true? Is that true for any of the
No.
other 7 species?
No.
There's never a quantity
No.
that high of, okay.
No, that's only for grains, for the cakes and cookies. Yeah. Not for the other fruits that you would say, you can set a meal on them, but you don't say the Birkat HaMazon. Okay? Yeah.
My question is about the bread for Khala. It must be like we have it 3 times for the Shabbat. Then it must be whole. That means that shouldn't be taken part of it.
Good, yeah.
Even for the 3rd one too, for the 3rd lunch.
3rd meal on Shabbat. Yeah. So it's good to have two loaves, but it's less of an obligation than the first 2 meals.
It shouldn't be like taking the part of it, like there was a
That's right, there's
sticker
the
on
best-
the bread and someone take it out and someone said, no, you can't do that.
Best not to take it off because it usually takes a little bit of the bread with the
Yeah.
sticker. It's a good question, yeah. But it's just an enhancement of the mitzvah to have the complete loaves as opposed to broken bread. It's not as pretty and not as advisable halachically.
Then for Seura Shlishi, it shouldn't be like a half of the bread and one full bread. Could be like that.
It's best to have 2 breads, even at the 3rd meal. It's still, they're all commemoration of the gift and the bounty that Hashem gave us with the manna. And why not have it at the 3rd meal too? If you don't have, you don't have to. You can still make a hamotzi on 1 slice of bread if you don't have a whole loaf. But it's not ideal.
There's a problem in the States, which is several years ago, Sarah decided to start pre-slicing all their bagels. And so when you're traveling somewhere, the only kosher bread you could find often would be like a frozen section that had these bagels. And so suddenly they were all showing up sliced, so you
Shame.
didn't have whole bread.
Shame, right?
You can always find Yehuda matzah in the kosher section. Again, it's the 1 meter wide column where they have, of course, they have everything that you need.
Filter
all year round,
fish.
like Gefilte fish, Yehuda
Depends
matzah.
where you are. in the country, if you're traveling.
Yeah, another question, Josh.
So on Shabbat, when you're doing hamotzi, you have to make it with both loaves together?
Ideally.
Ideally, okay.
Yeah, ideally.
And yet the day of the week, just one?
Just one.
bread.
Well, the truth is, during the week, it's better. It's always better to make the bracha over a whole item as opposed to a half. So if you have a whole tomato, better, and a half a tomato, better to make the bracha or priyadama on a whole tomato. Same thing with bread. During the week, if you have the ability, it's better to make a bracha on a whole loaf It's just nicer. It's nicer on the bracha. Holding it is nice too. It's also there's rules about everything, but the idea is particularly well known during the week on Shabbat, because during the week you don't necessarily have to have a whole loaf as a symbol of anything. And if you have sliced bread, if you get into the dining room sliced bread, so some people say you should make, it's better to make the bracha on a whole piece slice as opposed to half a slice. Just anything that has the wholeness to it enhances the beauty of the blessing, but it's not as critical as on Shabbat. Yeah.
I heard that it should be over 22 grams. That it's for that you do hamutzi lechem.
Yeah, there is a measurement. There is a measurement for it to
It's
be
like
considered.
one bread is 22 grams. We measure it at home.
Yeah, so it's a question how do you measure by weight or by volume, and it should be big enough for it to have a kazait in it.
Kazakh, yeah.
Kazait, the amount of an olive, but an olives are very small. Olives can be 10 grams. But we try to have 17 or 28 grams. It's usually the amount of the size of an olive. This is the standard measurement. But we'll talk about that another time. The measurements.
Is that true even when it's likely to result in waste? So let's say third meal, somebody walks in late, you've already said hamotzi, and you have a partial bread that they could use, or you can take a nice big challah, but they're gonna break off a little bit of it, the rest of it's eventually, let it rot or whatever, it'll end up in the garbage.
Well, you could put it back in the freezer and
Not usually, not that point usually.
Yeah, it's a trade-off there. It's a good question.
You're still better off doing it?
It's a trade-off because on the one hand you shouldn't be wasting food, on the other hand it's a mitzvah to have a complete bread in order to have
Right,
the
that's
two
my-
for
that's
Shabbat.
my question.
Yeah,
How would you weigh it?
it's hard to answer. It's hard to answer.
That's why I'm asking.
It's also expensive.
That's why I'm
It's
asking.
also expensive. Yeah, we have the same challenge.
There's no point.
So I'll tell you what I do without giving you a psak of something that you must do, because there's so many factors.
Okay.
But in my calculation, bread's not that expensive, and it's a special mitzvah to have two whole breads. So I usually do go for a new one. But what I usually do at home is I have in the freezer I have some pitot. And a pita is a whole bread. Even though there's a pocket inside, it's considered to be a whole bread, and so whoever comes late can always or matzah. You can take a slice of matzah, exactly. That's considered to be a separate whole bread. But anyways, we digress to the laws of Khala on Shabbat, and I want to talk to you about the other meaning of the word Khala, which is this separation of the dough, right? If you bake your challah without separating it, it's not kosher. Be careful, you got to know this stuff. If you bake bread at home, if you buy baked goods, that's why the bakeries need to have a hechsher, because the rabbi has to make sure that everything is tithed, the truma and the meiser, and this special type of truma called challah has to be taken by the bakeries. They have tremendously large amounts of dough quantities that for sure you're obligated even biblically. So yeah, the bakeries really have to know how to take off challah. I gave a hechsher once upon a time, we're talking about more than 15 years ago, I think, to a pizza place. And this was one of the big issues, is that they had to separate off the challah whenever they made the pizza, whenever they made their doughs. Now, you don't make the dough, it depends how much traffic you have coming into the pizza shop. If you have a pizza shop where they're continually making more and more dough, so you need a mashgiach. If they're not reliable, then you need someone to supervise them. And so he needs to be there all day. But where I was, it was this pretty small town, and they would make all their doughs at, say, 7 in the morning or 9 in the morning, and then they, put it in the freezer, put it in the fridge, and then from that they'd make pizza the rest of the day. They'd take off a small amounts of that big lump of dough. And so the mashgiach just had to come once in the morning, and he'd make sure to do the challah separating process, as we're going to learn about, once a day, and that was enough. Okay? But you had to,
They couldn't train their employees, the mashgiach would
You
make
could.
tests that the employees.
you could. It all depends
I
on
think
how.
pizza's easy, because you slice your pieces and you slice a nice little razor thin slice and you're good.
Usually you take off a little like a fist size amount of dough, and then you
Okay.
flatten it out, you roll it out, and you know the guys that twist it in the air, and you play with it, and you.
Lunches soon.
You're making me hungry, Ralph.
Is it? Well, it's coming soon. It's coming
Today
soon.
we will have a pizza.
Anyway, so, yes, a pizza. Pizza's dough, even though it doesn't turn into bread, as I said, but even for baking cakes and cookies. We're going to learn some of the laws. It can get really interesting that sometimes if you, in your own home, you have a very small amount, use 1 cup of flour. You don't have to take off challah. It's only 1 cup of flour. But then, and whatever, we're going to learn these laws, but I'll just give you a great example. Purim, in some communities, so everybody bakes some cookies, and you put one cookie, hamantash, and that's right. And you give gifts to everybody else. So the rabbi, I heard this year from Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, the former chief rabbi of Israel, and he described how he would have his table on the day of Purim. It was like loaded with cakes and cookies that everybody brought him. And he said, wait a minute. Each person baked a little bit amount of 1 batch of cookies, 2 batches of cookies. But now on my table, they're all joined together. I have so much amount of flour that's in these cakes and cookies. If they're all gathered together on my table, I have to take off challah. At this point, when you do have the requisite amount of flour there in the baked goods, so there's rules about exactly what makes the baked goods joined. When they were dough, you didn't have to take off any separating because there was a minimal amount. But when they're joined together later, you do have to take off the requisite challah. So we're going to learn all these rules about how to take off challah. I would really like to do an example with you, bring in some dough and make some pita.
Well, make some pizza.
Fun. Maybe make some pizza. It's a good idea.
That's a good idea. We can do that on
We can work it out. Okay, and we'll do that. Okay, so that's what we're going to learn this week. B'ezras Hashem, the rules of Khala. It just won't take more than a few days. It's not like 2 weeks like the Truma and Meiser. Really, we had a lot to learn. There was 2 types of Truma, 3 types of Meiser, and then Biur Meiser, and then we had to do what they did in the days of the temple, what they do now, and so it took us a while. But Khala, it's much shorter, but there's still a good amount of material to cover. We'll do that in the coming few days. B'ezras Hashem. Stop here. Have a good day.
My question is, it's over 800